So hello and welcome to day 7 of What the Dickens. We are nearly at the end of the first week of my grand love of Dickens, and today I'm going to be talking about David Copperfield. Chapter 1. I am born. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. Now, David Copperfield was, as it happens, Charles Dickens' favourite novel of all the novels that he had written, and I have a feeling that if I knew David Copperfield better, it would be a little further up my list. It is, along with Oliver Twist, the Dickens novel I know least. I have only read it once, and it was quite a while ago now. I am very fond of it, and I really love it, and I have many reasons to recommend it, but I have a feeling it would be overtaking tomorrow's novel, and possibly the novel after, if I had read it more and was therefore more fond of it. So David Copperfield follows the life of a man called David Copperfield from his birth through his childhood up to his adulthood. David Copperfield is Dickens' first novel that is in the first person, so we are in David's head throughout the whole book, and we follow David Copperfield right from the beginning right through to the end, all in first person, which I think makes David Copperfield a perfect place to start with Charles Dickens, because you don't have to worry about jumping between all the different characters and all the plots, because you have this one central protagonist, and the plot of David Copperfield, although it's still very complicated and many-layered, is a bit more straightforward than the plot of a lot of Dickens' other novels because it is in the first person. So the book opens with the birth of David Copperfield. His father has died shortly before his birth, and he grows up for the first 7 years of his life with his mother and their maid Peggotty, who is a lovely woman and a wonderful character. But when David Copperfield is 7 years old, his mother remarries. David is sent to live with Peggotty and her relatives by the sea for a little bit to get him out of the way, and when he comes back, he discovers that his mother's new husband, Mr. Murdstone, is not a very nice man. And it's from here that David Copperfield's adventures kind of begin. He gets sent away to a really horrible school and is recalled from this horrible school only on the death of his mother. David Copperfield is sent to live and work in London, even though he is still very young. He is only, I think, somewhere between like 10 and 12. While in London, he lives with a character called Mr. Micawber, who is brilliant. I love Mr. Micawber, and Mr. Micawber is constantly, forever in debt. He means so well, but he's always in debt. Various things go wrong, and David Copperfield ends up running away from London and running off to see the only relative he knows he still has alive, called Betsy Trotwood. How I love Betsy Trotwood. More on her anon. And the book kind of carries on from there. It kind of follows David Copperfield's life, his growing up, and then what happens to him when he's an adult. It is in many ways a kind of Bildun's Roman, I guess, and it is one of Dickens's novels that really does tell a life from kind of start to middle, as it were, not really till finish, because he's not old at the end of the book. There are a lot of recurring characters that turn up first off in David Copperfield's childhood and then later on in his adulthood in a really interesting way. It's quite layered and very Dickensian in the kind of coincidences and caricatures that are there, but it's also a really nice, poignant, touching story following one man's life. First off, reasons why I love David Copperfield. As I said, I think the plot is really strong and holds together really well. I, in general, prefer Dickens's novels that are not in first person and that follow a multitude of characters all crossing over and interlinking, because personally I love a lot of characters. I don't think that necessarily means that those novels are better than David Copperfield and Great Expectations, his two novels in the first person. And the nice thing about David Copperfield is you do get to follow him throughout his life, and you really get to see him develop and grow up as a character. Another thing I love about David Copperfield is that David feels like a child when he's a child. I spoke about, back on Monday, how Oliver Twist really irritates me in that the character of Oliver Twist never feels like a child, whereas David Copperfield does, and the way that Dickens in first person describes David Copperfield's childhood, you get the kind of interweaving of an older voice looking back on his childhood and the voice of a child, and you do see David Copperfield as a child, feeling and seeming and reading like a child. Another thing I love about David Copperfield is just there are so many brilliant characters in there. There are two people that David Copperfield goes to school with. One, James Steerforth, who is a bit of a scoundrel, a bit of a kind of Willoughby or Wickham figure, but more complicated than that, who David Copperfield really admires and loves as a boy, and then when he meets him later on in adult life, he is a very kind of complicated figure and a really interesting character. And another boy he goes to school with is called Tommy Traddles, and Tommy Traddles, I remember when I read David Copperfield, was one of my favourite characters in the book because he's really lovable and a really nice sort of friendly, pleasant character, a really nice sort of foil and friend to David Copperfield throughout the book. We also have the wonderfully comic Mr. Micawber, who keeps getting into debt but always means well and is so lovely and friendly to David Copperfield. The relationship between David Copperfield and Mr. Micawber cover is kind of that of like a surrogate father and son, and it's really nicely developed and really well done. I also adore David Copperfield's aunt, Betsy Trotwood. She is one of my favourite female characters in Dickens because she is eccentric and harsh, but also tender and lovely and kind, and just a thoroughly brilliant character. And with Betsy Trotwood there lives a man named Mr. Dick, who is quite an odd, eccentric gentleman, and he is trying to write a book, but he keeps on getting distracted by the mind of an old king, which he claims is invading his. The relationship him and Betsy Trotwood have, it's not a romantic one, but it's a really like lovely, tender companionship and friendship, and they both act as kind of surrogate parents to David Copperfield in a really pleasant, lovely way that is just a real joy to read about. I also think Peggotty is a brilliant character, and there are so many others as well. Agnes is quite an interesting character. Not so sure how I feel about Dora, but maybe a little bit more on that in a minute. And what I love about David Copperfield is the way that there are so many characters that he meets in childhood and then they kind of come back in adulthood in a really clever, lovely, very Dickensian way. I like as well that the book follows both his childhood and his adulthood. It's nice to have both of those sides of David Copperfield's character and to really see him develop as a person over the book. And there are certain themes which I think are really well developed, things about family which are really explored in the kind of surrogate parent figures that David Copperfield has quite a few of. And in David Copperfield there's also one particular event leads to a very interesting exploration of ideas of the fallen woman in Victorian society in a way that is quite interesting and not as confined by Victorian moral standards as you might expect it to be. It is very sympathetic to the woman who is deceived or seduced by this other man, but it's also not completely unsympathetic to the man in a really complicated way. It's just really interesting. There are a lot of very complicated characters in David Copperfield. It is Dickens' 8th novel, I believe, so it's in the second half of Dickens' career when his characters are beginning to get a bit more complicated, a bit more fully fledged, and just a bit more interesting. As you can tell, I really do love David Copperfield. On to things I like less about it. I don't have that much to say here. The reason why it's lower down the list is probably because I know it less. I imagine if I were to reread it, I would discover more things I love about it and probably also more things that I have a problem with, because I'm probably more of like an aware reader now than I was when I was like 15, 16 and I read this, especially in terms of like Dickens' presentation of women. When I think back to David Copperfield and I'm thinking about the female characters in it, I think to my mind they all seem quite positive, with the exception perhaps of Dora, but again in a minute. But it's just been so long since I read it that I can't fully comment on that as much as I could if I knew it as well as I know many of Dickens' other novels. Now Dora is a very interesting female character because in some ways she is representative of a lot of Dickens' early heroines in that she's very beautiful, she's very sweet, she is charming and lovely and kind, but she's not necessarily that clever. But unlike some of Dickens' earlier heroines, she is not very domestic. And when Dora is married, she struggles to kind of keep house and to do everything together because she's been brought up by her wealthy father to kind of not have to do anything for herself. And suddenly she is faced with the situation of having to do things for herself and she doesn't really succeed. And that is very interesting and a very kind of complicated presentation of women and what women should be able to do within Victorian society, especially when she is contrasted to the character of Agnes. And Agnes is another of Dickens' female angels. She is very pure, she is very quiet, she is very good, she's reserved, kind of everything Dickens seems to think women should be, including domestic and intelligent. And her and Dora's kind of comparison and the way their two characters play off each other is quite interesting. I don't know if that's something I don't like, or if I don't like the presentation of Dora, or if I think it's a really interesting comparison. I don't know. I need to reread it. Okay, that's basically what's come out of this David Copperfield video. I really need to reread David Copperfield. But before I go, I do quickly want to mention a TV adaptation, and that is this beautiful adaptation. Do you know who this is? It's Daniel Radcliffe playing David Copperfield as a child, which is great. And this also has Maggie Smith in playing Betsy Trotwood, and she is superb. She is superb. This is such a lovely, well done adaptation. I think it is brilliant. It's a shame they cut Tommy Traddles out because I really like him as a character, but aside from that I have nothing to fault it with. It is a really good, interesting exploration of the book, and the acting is really good. It's really well and nicely done. So I think that is basically all I had to say about David Copperfield. I do think it is a really good place to start with because it is in the first person and you're always following one character, which makes it a slightly more accessible Dickens novel than some of the rest of them. I also think it's got a really lot of lovable, brilliant characters and a really interesting, engaging plot. So yes, I highly recommend it. I'll be back tomorrow for the second week of What the Dickens, when I'll be talking about my 7th favourite Dickens novel. We're really getting into like the top ones now. A lot of Dickens love is to come in the next week. See you soon.